Thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here at the Tipping Point Conference, and it's wonderful to be here in Lithuania, a country that is, I think, standing up for freedom of expression and freedom of enterprise. And I'm here to try and cheer you up about the future. The future is terrible, isn't it? We have a pandemic, we have climate change, we have the rise of authoritarianism. There's a lot wrong with the world. But there's always been a lot wrong with the world. And in my lifetime, people have always been pessimistic about the future. And yet, in my lifetime, the world has seen an extraordinary transformation in the lives of most people, in amazing improvements in their living standards, in their lifespan, in their health. So why do we think that just because it's been getting better in the past, it's going to get worse in the future? I'm here to try and persuade you that that's not the case. Woody Allen once said, "Mankind stands at a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. But we must choose between these two." But need it be like that? Why couldn't the future be good as well as bad, or instead of bad? We don't appreciate what's going on in the world. If you ask people this question, has the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty doubled, halved, or stayed the same over the last 20 years? In almost every country, you get the same answer. 65% of people think it has doubled, 5% think it has halved. The 5% are right. It has halved. The percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty is down by 1/2 in just 20 years. And Hans Rosling, who first asked this question of 1,000 people in America, had a further thought. He thought, well, hang on, if I wrote those 3 answers on 3 bananas and threw them into a cage with a monkey in it, the monkey would pick up the right answer 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. It would do 6 times better than human beings at answering a question about human society. How can that be? How come we're not just ignorant about the state of humanity? We're actively, knowledgeably wrong. As Josh Billings put it, it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that ain't so. So I think it's worth examining what's happened in the world. Income corrected for inflation has trebled in my lifetime. Lifespan has gone from 49 to 71 globally. Child mortality is down by 2/3, the greatest measure of misery anybody can think of. And we are healthier, happier, cleverer, cleaner, kinder, freer, more peaceful, and more equal than we have ever been. You don't believe that? Well, look at the numbers. The lifespan has improved, the infectious diseases, except COVID, are in retreat. And even age-adjusted cancer mortality is declining, so we're healthier. People get happier when they get richer. We used to think they didn't, but we now know they do. Some people are very rich and very unhappy, but that's all right. It cheers other people up when that happens. And the number of people in education is going up all the time, so we're cleverer. The amount of oil spilled in the ocean is down by 90% since the 1970s. There's a lot of the environment is getting cleaned up. The amount of violence in the world, warfare, in steady decline. So despite what people think, where there's fewer wars on the planet now than ever. And as for more equal, well, over the last 50 years, the people in poor countries have been getting rich much faster than people in rich countries. And that has shrunk the gap globally. The gap is still very big within countries, but globally that gap is decreasing all the time. So there's a lot of good news out there, and good news, of course, is no news. It doesn't make the news. So even this underestimates what has happened, because it doesn't take into account changes in technology. How much does it cost you to have artificial light? I'm standing here in a blaze of artificial light. it's very, very cheap these days. It used to be very, very expensive to have artificial light. This is the cost of lighting calculated over several centuries. And it's just gone from very expensive to very cheap. That's a measure of how much our lives have improved, because you've got access to something. But if you measure it in money, it underestimates what's happened. Because if you measure it in time, the time it takes you to earn enough money to switch on a lamp, then you see the most remarkable change. How long do you have to work on the average wage to be able to switch on a lamp for an hour? And the answer is about 1/3 of a second. But your grandparents in the 1950s would have had to work for 8 seconds, a lot longer, to earn that much light. Back in 1880, 15 minutes of work would have got you that much light. And in 1800, 6 hours. 6 hours of work for 1 hour of light. The average person could not afford a candle in 1800, despite what you see on television plays about that time. So we are not only, with this technology, we are creating improbable structures in the world. We are making things that are reversing the entropy of the world, that are giving us useful objects, useful services with the random stuff of the world. And that process, I think, could be infinite. I don't think there's any limits to how far we could go in creating this improbability, this improvement in our lives. Why could it be infinite? Surely we'd run out of resources eventually. No, because one of the things we do with innovation is that we reduce the amount of, we do more with less. So we use less land to produce a given amount of food than we used to. We use less metal in a drinks can. We use less material in a car. So even when we get to the point where we've run out of all new forms of innovation, we could always say, let's just use a little bit of yet less of something to do more. And that means that innovation is potentially infinite. On my desk at home sits this object. It's an Australian hand axe of the kind used by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. My wife bought it for me on eBay. And right next to it used to sit an object of exactly the same size and shape. And this sent a shiver down my spine when I first spotted the similarity, because this is a link between me and an ancestral hominid from 500,000 years ago. And in this image, you see the entire history of human innovation. They're both designed to fit the human hand. But one is made from a single substance and was made by the person who used it, whereas the other one is made from lots of different substances and embodies different ideas, different materials, different ideas that occurred to different people in different times and different places, which came together in this object. And that, to me, is the great beauty of innovation, is that it allows us to effectively work for each other. Thousands of people were involved in the creation of that mouse, and they were all working for me. And I was working for them too, because I was earning money and buying the mouse, which gave them a living, and so on. So there's the big theme of human history, in my view, is that we become more specialized in what we produce so that we can become more diversified in what we consume. And when if you think about the history of how people used to live in the old days, rich people had a lot of people working for them. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But each of you has 498 people to prepare your dinner every night. They're in restaurants and bistros and cafes all across town. And they're working for other people as well as you. But you end up with the lifestyle of a king because you have all these people working for you through the magic of exchange. The simplest object that we use, like a pencil, is the result of extensive collaboration. There's a wonderful little essay by Leonard Read called I, Pencil, written in the 1950s, about a pencil which decides to try and understand where it came from. And it researches its history, and it discovers that it is the product of collaboration between hundreds, even thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people all across the world. People cutting down trees to make the wood, people growing coffee for the people cutting down trees, etc., etc. They're all involved in the creation of this one simple object. Yet, not one of them knows how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody on the planet knows how to make a pencil. The knowledge that the man on the production line doesn't know, he just knows how to operate his machinery, because he doesn't know how to cut down a tree. The knowledge of how to make even the simplest objects in our society is not held inside brains, it's held between brains, it's held among us, it's held in a giant collaborative cloud. That's the way society works. And what that tells us is that the process of innovation is a process of collaboration, it's a process of experimentation, it's a process of discovery. And I argue that there are themes about human innovation that we need to distinguish from what we think. We think of the heroic inventor who comes up with the first airplane or the first light bulb, and we give him a patent or a Nobel Prize, and we say, isn't that fantastic, he's changed the world. In fact, it's not like that. What really happens is that there is collaboration between lots of different people, which allows gradual improvement, which encourages serendipitous discovery. So, for example, people often discover things different from what they set out to discover. It's much more gradual. Once you look if you look at the invention of the airplane or the light bulb, you find that there was years and years of gradual work before it. Something like Moore's law, the improvement in computing over time, shows just how steady and gradual the world is in terms of improvement. It's also evolutionary. I came here yesterday on an airplane. That was a brand new airplane. They were boasting about how efficient it was when I was on it. It was designed by an engineer, right? Well, was it really? I mean, he didn't start from scratch. He didn't, begin with a blank sheet and say, I'm going to design an airplane. He took a previous design and improved it. And that previous design had been taken from a previous design and improved, and so on, all the way back to the Wright brothers in 1903. The bad designs had been abandoned, and the good designs had been kept. So it's a process of natural selection, just like evolution. And it enables us to progress as an evolutionary phenomenon. Now, evolution works by recombination. That is to say, through sexual reproduction, two different organisms come together and merge their genes so that you can inherit good traits from two different lines of lineages. That's the purpose of sex. That's the effect of sex. Exchange plays the same role in innovation in human societies, that by bringing together the work of different people, we're able to combine and recombine technologies. An awful lot of the technologies we invent are actually existing technologies combined in new ways. It's very important to allow trial and error if you're going to have innovation in society. If you talk to inventors, they always talk about being free to make lots of mistakes along the way. Thomas Edison tried 6,000 different materials before he settled on Japanese bamboo for the filament of his first light bulb. And here's a funny thing about the first light bulb. Edison wasn't the only person to invent a light bulb. There were 21 different people who invented the light bulb independently around the same time. There was Swan in England, Lodygin in Russia, and so on and so on. How did that happen? What's going on here? How come you get this phenomenon of simultaneous invention? It's true of almost every technology you look at, that you get people inventing something around the same time and getting very angry with each other because they both think they deserve the credit. And the answer is because there's a kind of inevitability, there's an inexorability about innovation. Once it gets started, it's going to happen. Whoever's out there doing it because the next step is logical, obvious, and ripe, ready to go. And yet, when we come to experience the effect of innovation on society, we experience a strange phenomenon whereby at first we're disappointed and then we're overwhelmed. So if you think about the internet or the mobile phone or genomics or any of these technologies, everybody makes enormous promises and we then spend 10 or 15 years saying, well, what happened to that? And then suddenly it takes off. It was Roy Amara who first coined this. He said, we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. And this non-linear effect often takes us by surprise and is why we don't really appreciate what's going to happen next. And we can't. And it makes it very difficult to predict the future. Anyone who tells you they can tell you what the future is going to look like in technology should not be believed. Some technologies go on disappointing for a long time. Some are spectacular improvements. So that's what's happened to the average GDP per capita, per person in the world since 1600, sorry. It's the most extraordinary phenomenon. We are incredibly lucky to live in a world where this has happened. And at every point along that line, somebody has said, it can't go on. Throughout history, people have always said, yeah, it's fine up until now, but I promise you it's going to get worse next. So here's a quote. Thomas Babington Macaulay, the historian, writing in 1830, we cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a tipping point, that we have seen our best days. But so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we're to expect nothing but deterioration before us? Bear that in mind when the wonderful next speakers you're about to hear tell you that I'm wrong and that we're about to plunge into a terrible future. It's true that my own pessimism wavers, particularly in the middle of the night, and that I start thinking, hang on a minute, there's an awful lot wrong with the world. The combination of bureaucracy and superstition that sank the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire and the Arabian civilization, these forces are gathering again, and it could all go horribly wrong, and I'll look very foolish. And maybe they're right, people who say that. But there's quite a good chance that they're not. Innovation is the child of freedom, and if we keep freedom going, then I think we can have a bright future for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this inspiring first presentation. Let's see if we get questions on Slido. I remind you there is an opportunity, you have a code here. When you are this optimistic, I know that you have received this critique a lot, but I was just very interested in what you have to say to this. Aren't you simply saying what the rich want to hear?
No, I think I'm saying the opposite. I think I'm saying what the poor want to hear. Because actually the rich haven't got that much richer. It's the poor who've really seen the improvements in the last few decades. There's an interesting thought experiment. If you're in a meeting with 10 people in a room, and one of them is a billionaire, can you tell? Is he taller? Is he fatter? Are his trousers better than other people's trousers?
Normally not.
Probably not these days. And that's because most of the inequality now, particularly in Western societies, is in the form of luxury. I mean, he's got a private jet parked outside, but so what? You know, in the things that really matter, has he got enough food? Has he got enough education, etc., etc.? The differences are getting smaller.
So you're saying what the poor want to hear. Okay, what is your stance on climate change, people are asking then, and Earth's resources?
Well, I think climate change is real. I think it's happening. I think it's an issue. I think it could become problematic. But I think many people are greatly exaggerating the speed and urgency of the threat, and we are rushing into solutions that are making the lives of people worse, particularly if we start rationing energy, the availability of energy, particularly to poor people. There's 1 billion people in Africa without electricity. Well, most of them are in Africa, some of them elsewhere in the world. That's a much more urgent issue in terms of human welfare than whether or not temperatures are going to go up in 10 or 20 years' time to a significant degree.
But people would say that temperatures have gone up. We have floods and storms, and that has direct and indirect impact on deaths.
The number of people dying of climate-related disasters, floods, droughts and storms, has been falling steadily. It's down by about 95% since the 1920s. That's not because the climate's got less dangerous. The climate might have got a little bit more dangerous, but it's because we've got better shelter, better communication, better transport, better warnings. All these kind of things are improving all the time. So it's very rare now for a major tropical cyclone or hurricane to cause very large numbers of death. There was a terrible one in Myanmar, in Burma, about 20 years ago. But the ones that have hit Central America most recently, or indeed the one in Louisiana the other day, kills a very small number of people. And the frequency and strength of tropical storms is not increasing, actually. There's no evidence that it's going up.
Too bad we don't have a climate expert on stage. I'm sure they would have to say a lot to that. But let's see, there's a climate-related question on Slido. Would you agree that we are close to a point where we will need to start limiting individual consumption to reduce the consumption of natural resources and pollution?
Well, no, I don't agree with that, because I think that, as I said, one of the things we do with innovation is we do more with less. We use less land. We use 68% less land to produce a given amount of food now than we did 50 years ago. That's a very good example of using fewer of a vital resource. Land is a very important resource. We want to use as little as possible. And if, for example, we were to move a lot of agriculture indoors using the new LED lighting technology, which we're already doing, particularly in Japan, for growing salads and lettuces and things like that, then we could give an awful lot of land back to nature. So actually, I think limiting the amount of, limiting innovation would be a disaster for nature. It's much better to be innovative and do more with less, and as a result, have a lighter impact on the planet.
So when we hear a lot of presentations in which business people would say that there is no other way but green innovations, you won't be the one to object.
Yes, as long as they are green. I don't like renewable energy because it's going back to using the whole landscape to produce energy. The footprint of a nuclear power station, compared with the footprint of an equivalent wind farm, is minute. The amount of steel, the amount of concrete, the amount of land is just on a different scale. And I think it's better to go for the smaller footprint rather than the bigger footprint. An awful lot of so-called green technologies are asking us to go back to using nature. And I don't want to do that. I want to leave nature alone.
In which field would you expect the biggest breakthrough happening in the next 10 years?
Well, remember what I said about how the future is non-linear.
Yes.
And therefore, it's very difficult to forecast the future. And actually, I don't think anyone gets this right. There are some spectacularly foolish forecasts about the future. You know, the head of the mini-computer company in the 1970s said, no one would need a computer in their home. And he was making the smallest computers there were. Steve Ballmer, the head of Microsoft, said that the iPhone's going to get no market share. Absolutely none.
But if you had to pick one, it's exciting for us to hear.
But why should I make a fool of myself in front of all of you?
Well, you don't necessarily have to.
You press me. Right. Well, I think that gene editing is a fantastic development in the last 10 years. The CRISPR technology for subtly editing genetic sequences is going to be fantastically useful in agriculture. It's going to be incredibly important in medicine. After all, these vaccines are the product of it already. And it's also going to have a role in conservation. I think it's going to enable us to control invasive species. It's going to enable us to reverse the extinction of some species. We're going to bring back the passenger pigeon, the great hawk, and the mammoth. Not in my lifetime, perhaps, but in the next few decades. So I think these I think the last 50 years were dominated. If you think about the first half of the 20th century was dominated by transport improvements, incredible changes in transport. My grandparents, were born before the motor car and the aeroplane, and they died with man on the moon and supersonic planes in the air. But they saw almost no change in computing and communications. They were born with the telephone, they died with the telephone. I've had the opposite experience. The transport has gone nowhere in my lifetime. We
have driverless cars that will soon be available for everyone.
But 747s lasted for 50 years. Imagine a computer that you're still using for 50 years. So we've seen incredible changes in computing in the last 50 years, incredible changes in transport before that. I don't think the next 50 years are going to be about computing. I think the obsession with artificial intelligence may prove to be overblown. That's why I think genetic technologies are probably more interesting. But remember, I'm wrong about the future. Everybody is.
Okay, we'll remember that, and I'm sure that the artificial intelligence session will prove that as well, which we are going to have this afternoon. But there are questions coming in, so we don't let you go just yet. There's a question from Lamus, who says, what would your comment be on the following quote? Hard times create strong people, and strong people create great time, and great times create weak people, and weak people create hard times.
That's wonderful. I'd never heard that. That's a great quote. And there might be something true in that. But when people say that necessity is the mother of invention, that it's only because we're desperate, because we've got a huge problem to solve, that we invent things, that's not the pattern you find in history. In history, innovation tends to come from relatively wealthy societies that are doing quite well. It comes from California in the 20th century, or Renaissance Italy in the 16th century. It doesn't come from the most desperate places. And so I think the idea that we have to have a problem before we even think about solving it is wrong. But I do think there's something in the second half of the quotation that we get to the point where we think we can now be complacent about innovation. It'll happen anyway, and we can now concentrate on something else and take our eye off the ball. And I do think that societies do that.
That was a rather explicit answer. I hope that the anonymous person who's asked it is content with it, and we are almost running out of time, but there are people objecting to what you're saying, and I want to necessarily read those objections and see what you have to say to that. 0.1% of American families enjoy almost as much wealth as 90% of the rest of the country put together. How come quality has gone better over time, and particularly during the pandemic?
Yeah, well, there is a lot of inequality, particularly in the United States. It is extreme in some ways. In China too, as the whole country has got richer, the very rich have got very rich. So yes, the difference does increase. But in a country like China, the poorest have become middle-income people. And that's a huge improvement in welfare. So where does that enormous inequality come from in societies like China or the US? An awful lot of it comes from government favoritism towards certain industries, barriers to entry created by lobbying and things like that. If you allow full free competition, you tend to erode these inequalities. So I think that a lot of this is not coming from free enterprise, it's coming from government interference in free enterprise.
And probably the last one, just to wrap up and to go back to our climate discussion, a very, very specific question from Danus. So, petrol or electricity would be driving future vehicles?
Electricity is a fantastic technology, and I'm all in favor of it. And if, you know, the silence, the cleanliness of cars that are electric is great. But we do have a problem, which is that you've got to generate it from somewhere, and you've got to find a way of charging cars quickly, the inconvenience factor, etc. We had electric cars, funnily enough, before we had internal combustion engines. There were electric cars around the turn of the 20th century, and they died out in competition with internal combustion engines. We haven't found a way of storing energy cheaply, efficiently, and easily comparable with a petrol tank yet. And we need to crack that problem. I suspect we will all eventually use electricity for most of our transport, but I'm worried that we're pushing that too fast and that actually you're going to get a lot of reaction from people which will make it hard to achieve that transition.
Thank you so much for your perspective, for your presentation, and for all of the questions that you have taken. Let's give Matt Ridley a big round of applause.
Thank you.